Okay, ready to dive into some pretty heavy stuff today.
Yeah, let's do it.
We're going to be talking about organized violence and how it's played out in two historical narratives that you might think are totally different at first glance. We've got, on the one hand, Columbus and the whole colonization of the Americas.
Right.
And on the other hand, the rise of Zionism and the formation of Israel.
It's fascinating, because when you look closer, even though these events happen worlds apart, literally different continents and time periods, there are some, disturbing similarities, especially when you look at how militias, these paramilitary groups were used, how indigenous populations were displaced from their lands, and the ways that different organizations, they actually legitimized taking over more and more territory.
So, to be clear, we're not saying these two historical narratives are identical, but by putting them side by side, by comparing them, we can start to see a much bigger picture emerge.
Yeah.
This really unsettling phenomenon of settler colonialism. And the sources we've got for this deep dive, they don't hold back.
No, they don't.
The details are intense. We're talking about specific massacres like the Mystic Massacre back in 1637, where hundreds of Pequot people were burned alive. And then, fast forward to 1948, the Deir Yassin massacre, where over 100 Palestinians were killed.
These events, they really force us to confront the human cost of these conflicts.
Yeah.
And how so often violence was justified. Like it was spun as this necessary thing, a way to civilize or defend.
Right.
It's so important to unpack how these narratives were built, how they were used to dehumanize indigenous populations in both cases.
Okay, so let's rewind all the way back. 1492. Columbus lands in the Americas.
Okay.
And honestly, the sources paint a pretty grim picture. It doesn't take long for things to turn violent. Like we're talking just a few years later, 1495, Columbus and his men are attacking the Taino people, decimating their population.
Yeah.
And then comes the encomienda system, right? Where indigenous people are forced into labor, exploited brutally. It's a textbook case of organized violence to establish dominance.
And what's striking to me is how quickly the system was actually legalized.
Right.
It's not just about individual acts of brutality. It was a whole structure sanctioned by the authorities, a calculated way to exploit the native population, take their resources.
It's like, it wasn't random chaos.
No.
It was systematic.
Absolutely.
And it's almost like a blueprint,
Right.
that gets repeated. Jump ahead to the 1600s, and you see English settlers in North America. They're forming their own militias, grabbing land, and getting into these brutal conflicts like the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. And this is where we see groups like the Virginia Company popping up. They weren't a military force, right? It was a private company. But they were given this royal charter to colonize the land, basically setting the stage for generations of conflict, really.
The Virginia Company is a perfect example of how so much of this was driven by money, by economics, territorial expansion, and these organizations. They were crucial in making it all seem legitimate, it was the right thing to do. That charter from the King of England, it gave them the authority to not just build settlements, but to actually displace native populations. And then you've got the Jamestown colonists struggling at first, but eventually they find success growing tobacco. And suddenly there's this insatiable demand for land. It pushes them further and further into indigenous territory.
And then you have someone like John Rolfe. Can't talk about this period without mentioning him. Instrumental in establishing the tobacco industry in Virginia. He's a really, a controversial figure, to say the least. People know him for marrying Pocahontas. Some people try to romanticize that.
Right.
But the reality is he was deeply involved in a system that profited from exploiting both indigenous people and enslaved Africans.
You're exactly right. We have to acknowledge that these individuals, the roles they played, it was complex, often contradictory.
So as the English settlements spread, there's this growing need for protection.
Right.
From the indigenous population, of course. And that leads directly to the rise of these colonial militias.
You can almost think of them as like armed neighborhood watch groups.
Yeah.
Except they were also tasked with expanding the colony's territory.
Yeah, that's a pretty key difference.
Right. And what's interesting is how the whole idea of the militia, it actually evolved over time. At first, it was just these ad hoc groups of settlers. They'd grab their muskets whenever trouble seemed near. But as the colonies developed, militias got more, official, better armed, and they often acted with the full support, if not direct orders, of the colonial government.
So they became a real tool of state power.
Exactly.
And those militias, they were responsible for some truly horrific acts of violence, like the Mystic Massacre that we mentioned before. 1637, Captain John Mason, he leads a colonial militia made up of English colonists and some Narragansett and Mohegan allies against the Pequot village near Mystic River. They surround the village, set it on fire, killing over 600 Pequot men, women, and children. Just a deliberate act of terror meant to crush any Pequot resistance.
And that event, I mean, it's so important because it shows how violence was used strategically.
Right.
To instill fear, to subjugate indigenous populations. The sheer brutality of the Mystic Massacre. It sent a chilling message to other tribes. Don't resist.
Don't even think about it. And it's important to remember these massacres weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger pattern. The Pequot War itself, it's a prime example of how violence just escalated in the Americas during this period.
It's crucial to understand the context of that war, though. You've got English settlers rapidly encroaching on Pequot land. Tensions were already running high, trade disputes, cultural clashes, and then this English trader, John Oldham, he's killed by a group of Narragansett. But the English blamed the Pequot, and that became the spark that ignited the war.
So the English saw the Pequot, who were a powerful tribe in that region, as a major obstacle to their expansion.
Yeah.
And the war itself was brutal. Ambushes, raids, villages destroyed.
On both sides. And the result, devastating for the Pequot. The tribe was virtually wiped out, their land taken. The survivors, the few that were left, sold into slavery or forced to assimilate into other tribes. The Pequot War, with the Mystic Massacre as this horrific centerpiece, it broke the power of the Pequot, and it paved the way for English expansion in New England.
So we see how these events in the Americas, from Columbus's arrival to the rise of these colonial militias, they set a really disturbing precedent.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit. Look at what's happening over in Palestine during the same time frame.
So while the Americas are being colonized by European powers, you have to remember, Palestine is under the control of the Ottoman Empire at this point. The context is totally different.
Right.
But what we start to see are these early stirrings of what will eventually become the Zionist movement.
And we're talking about the late 1800s here, right?
Exactly. You see Jewish nationalism growing in Europe, fueled by anti-Semitism and this longing for a Jewish homeland. And then Theodore Herzl, considered the father of modern Zionism, he publishes his book, The Jewish State, in 1896.
Right.
It advocates for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And that was a turning point. It gave the movement a real ideology and a plan of action.
And that's when organizations like the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish National Fund start to emerge.
Right. You've got the World Zionist Organization, founded in 1897. They wanted to promote Jewish immigration to Palestine, lay the groundwork for that future Jewish state. And then the Jewish National Fund, established in 1901, they were all about purchasing land in Palestine for Jewish settlement.
It's interesting how even at this early stage, the focus is on getting land. That's the key step towards establishing a Jewish presence in Palestine.
Absolutely. And this emphasis on acquiring land, it would become central.
Yeah.
A central and often very contentious part of the Zionist project. The Jewish National Fund, they played a big role in buying land, often from absentee landlords, which often meant displacing Arab tenant farmers who were already living and working on that land. And this practice, it contributed to growing tension between the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine. We're going to delve deeper into those tensions and how they really escalated in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork here. We've seen how organized violence, the displacement of indigenous populations, these were key features of both European colonization in the Americas and the very early stages of the Zionist movement in Palestine. It's heavy stuff, but I think it's so important to understand these historical roots as we move forward.
And keep in mind, this is just the beginning. We've only just scratched the surface of these complex and, interconnected histories.
Yeah.
In the next part, we're going to explore how these patterns of violence and displacement, how they continue to play out as both of these narratives unfold, ultimately leading us to the present day and the enduring legacy of these conflicts. So, picking up where we left off, let's look at the period between the 1600s and the 1800s.
Okay.
In the Americas, this is, the heart of Anglo-American settler colonialism. You have all these conflicts, the Pequot War, King Philip's War, just brutal displacement of Native Americans.
And it's really interesting, I think, to compare this to what's going on in Palestine at roughly the same time. The Ottomans are in control there. And while Zionism as this political movement, it hasn't really taken shape yet, you do see those early signs of Jewish migration to Palestine.
And it's so important to understand the context here. The Ottoman Empire, they had their own complex systems, land ownership, governance.
Right.
Jewish communities in Palestine, they were largely integrated into that system. It's not the same as what we see later on with, Zionist state building.
But the sources do mention tensions,
Right.
Particularly between Jewish settlers and Arab communities over land and resources.
Absolutely. As we move into the late 1800s, early 1900s, Zionism really crystallizes. It becomes a political movement.
Mm-hmm.
Theodore Herzl, can't talk about this period without mentioning him. He publishes The Jewish State in 1896, advocating for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And that marks a significant shift, I think.
Yeah, it does. And with organizations like the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish National Fund, you start to see a much more organized effort to acquire land, promote Jewish settlement.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's reminiscent of what we saw with the Virginia Company.
Yeah.
But on a different scale.
Right. So you have the World Zionist Organization, formed in 97.
Right.
Their goal is to facilitate Jewish immigration to Palestine, lay the foundation for that future Jewish state.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Jewish National Fund, a few years later, 1901, they're laser-focused on purchasing land for Jewish settlement.
So you've got these organizations actively working to acquire land in Palestine. I mean, what was the situation on the ground? What does this actually mean for the people who are already living there?
That's where things get really complicated, you know?
Yeah.
Palestine wasn't like empty. It wasn't this blank slate just waiting for settlers. There were already people living there, primarily Arabs, many of whom had been there for generations. And these land purchases by the Jewish National Fund, often from absentee landlords, it resulted in the displacement of Arab tenant farmers. And that displacement, it really fueled resentment.
Right.
Laid the groundwork for future conflicts.
It's starting to sound familiar, right?
Yeah.
Displacing indigenous populations, making way for settlers, this sense of, I don't know, entitlement to the land.
Exactly. And as Jewish migration to Palestine increased, those tensions with the Arab population, they just kept rising.
Yeah.
And then things get even more complicated when the British gain control of Palestine after World War I.
Right.
In 1917, they issue the Balfour Declaration, promising to support a Jewish national home in Palestine. And that declaration, it was, I guess, well-intentioned in some ways.
Yeah.
But it just added another layer of complexity to an already really tense situation.
Wait, so the British promised a Jewish homeland, but Palestine was still technically under Ottoman control.
Yeah.
I mean, that's setting the stage for conflict right there.
It really is. The Balfour Declaration, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. It gave the Zionist movement energy, for sure, international recognition, political leverage. But it also made the Arab population very worried.
Yeah, of course.
They were afraid of being displaced from their own land. And in many ways, that declaration, it sowed the seeds for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's still going on today.
It's like the British were, I don't know, playing both sides.
Yeah.
Promising something to two groups with very different and ultimately conflicting aspirations. So, I mean, how did that actually play out on the ground?
Well, Jewish immigration to Palestine, it increased significantly after the Balfour Declaration. And this led to more land purchases and, sadly, more displacement of Arab tenant farmers. But at the same time, you also have Arab nationalism on the rise, fueled by these fears about losing their land, becoming a minority in their own country. So tensions escalate, and you start to see riots, clashes between Jewish settlers and Arabs. The British administration is struggling to maintain any kind of control.
It sounds like a very volatile mix.
Yeah.
Competing nationalisms, land disputes, British intervention. It's a recipe for disaster.
And unfortunately, things just continued to deteriorate. In the 1930s, with the backdrop of the rise of Nazism in Europe, Jewish immigration to Palestine, it surges even further. And this influx, combined with the economic hardship of the Great Depression, it just made things worse, exacerbated those tensions with the Arab population.
So it's not just about ideology and land. It's economic factors that are fueling this conflict as well.
Absolutely. Economic anxieties, competition for scarce resources, all of that played a significant role. And then in 1936, a large-scale Arab revolt breaks out in Palestine.
Yeah, the sources mentioned the 1936-39 Arab revolt. What can you tell us about that?
So it was a major uprising against British rule and against Jewish immigration. It lasted for 3 years, and it was complex. Different factions, different motivations within the Arab community. Some wanted independence. Others just wanted to stop Jewish immigration, and the revolt was brutally suppressed by the British. A lot of casualties on both sides, and it further polarized the Jewish and Arab communities and really highlighted the fact that the British, they had failed to find any kind of lasting solution to this conflict.
It's striking how both in the Americas and in Palestine during this period, you see this rise of armed groups, militias, paramilitary organizations. Seems like violence was becoming, more normalized as a way to achieve political goals.
Yeah, you're right. In the Americas, you have groups like the Colorado Volunteers, who were responsible for the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864.
Right.
Over 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women and children, slaughtered. Just horrific violence. Even some people within the U.S. government were shocked by it.
And in Palestine, Zionist organizations are forming their own defense forces.
Right. The Haganah, which emerges in the 1920s, they were the main Jewish paramilitary group in Palestine. At first, they were mostly focused on defending Jewish settlements from Arab attacks, but they also engaged in retaliatory operations.
And then, of course, you have the Irgun, much more militant group. They split from the Haganah in the 30s. They're known for carrying out attacks against British and Arab targets, including the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946.
Right. The Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, who would go on to become Prime Minister of Israel, they believed in armed struggle against British rule. They saw violence as a necessary tool to achieve Jewish statehood. And the King David Hotel bombing, targeting the British administrative headquarters, extremely controversial. 91 people died.
Wow.
Arabs, Jews, Britons. It really exemplifies that escalating violence, the increasingly desperate measures that some of these Zionist groups were taking.
So while the contexts are different, we're seeing a similar pattern.
Right.
The rise of militias, paramilitary groups, using violence to secure land, protect settlements, and ultimately, to advance their own political agendas.
And it's not just about the physical violence, it's about the ideologies that are driving these actions, that are justifying them.
Yeah.
You mentioned manifest destiny in the Americas.
Right.
That belief that westward expansion was divinely ordained, that narrative, it dehumanizes Native Americans, justifies their displacement.
And within the Zionist movement, you have this range of ideologies as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Some advocated for peaceful coexistence with the Arab population. They emphasized shared religious and cultural ties. But others, especially those influenced by revisionist Zionism, they believed that the way to establish a Jewish state was through territorial expansion. They saw the Arab population as an obstacle to be overcome.
It's interesting how both sides, even though they're worlds apart, they draw upon religious narratives, historical narratives, to legitimize their actions.
It's a common thread in settler colonialism, this belief that you have a superior claim to the land, whether it's based on religion, destiny, something else. It doesn't really matter. Those narratives, they're so important for understanding how people make sense of what they're doing, especially when it comes to things like violence, dispossession. They create this moral framework, a sense of righteousness. And it can blind people to the suffering they're inflicting on others.
So we've covered a lot here. The rise of militias, the escalation of violence, the clash of ideologies, the devastating impact on indigenous populations in both the Americas and in Palestine. It's a pretty bleak picture, and it feels like we're heading towards a major confrontation in both cases.
You're right. And as we move into the mid-20th century, both of these narratives, they reach this critical turning point. The tensions that have been building for decades, fueled by land disputes, competing nationalisms, and just escalating violence, they boil over. In the Americas, the Indian Wars come to this tragic conclusion. You have the forced relocation and assimilation of Native American tribes. And in Palestine, the British mandate collapses, leading to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and the creation of the State of Israel. These are pivotal events. They had profound and lasting consequences, and they really shaped the political landscape of both regions for, decades to come.
This is where our deep dive takes this really dramatic turn.
Yeah.
We're entering this period of intense conflict, displacement, and just a lot of political upheaval. It's a story that's both fascinating and, honestly, deeply troubling. And it's essential to understand these events, I think, if we want to even begin to grapple with the legacies of settler colonialism that are still shaping our world today.
Absolutely. And we're going to delve into those pivotal events and their aftermath in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay. Exploring how the patterns of violence and dispossession that we've been talking about, how they continue to play out in the modern era.
Okay, so we've gone from Columbus landing in the Americas all the way to the rise of Zionism in Palestine. And we've seen how organized violence and pushing indigenous people off their land were key parts of both of those stories. But now, let's bring it all into the present day, where honestly, it feels like those echoes of history are still ringing pretty loud.
And it's not just echoes, it's the struggles that are still going on, the tactics that are changing, these new challenges to Indigenous sovereignty. That's what we need to really grasp.
In the Americas, the fight for Indigenous rights, it's taken on these new forms. You see these legal battles over land, treaty rights, and then you've got these powerful movements like the Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock. Yeah, and it's amazing to see how these modern movements, they draw strength from the resistance of their ancestors.
Yeah.
They're reclaiming their history, their languages, their cultural practices. It's a really powerful way to challenge those injustices that are still happening.
And then you look at Israel-Palestine. I mean, the period after 1948, it's been constant conflict, displacement, the expansion of Israeli settlements into the occupied territories. It's like all those issues we've been talking about, they just got amplified.
And that raises this really important question, I think. How does that legacy of historical violence shape what's happening now?
Yeah.
In both the Americas and Israel-Palestine, those past injustices, they fuel resentment, mistrust, this tragic cycle of violence that is so hard to break.
And it's not just governments anymore either.
Right.
The sources talk about this rise of modern paramilitary groups on both sides.
Right.
In the U.S., you've got groups like the Arizona Border Recon, basically vigilantes targeting migrants with these brutal tactics.
And in Israel, you have radical settler groups, like the Hilltop Youth, attacking Palestinian villages, property. Often, it seems like, with this tacit support from, elements within the Israeli government, it's this really disturbing echo of that settler vigilantism we saw centuries ago.
It's kind of chilling to think about how those patterns, those things established so long ago, are still playing out today in these really dangerous ways. Makes you wonder if we ever really learned from history.
And these groups, they often operate with this sense of impunity, like they believe they're defending their communities, their people, some greater cause. And that righteousness, built on these narratives of victimhood, entitlement, it makes it so much harder to address, the root causes of the violence, to find some path towards dialogue and reconciliation.
So, after all this, after this whole deep dive, what's the takeaway? What have we learned from looking at these parallels of organized violence, from Columbus all the way to the present day?
For me, it's about understanding that history, it's not just these facts, these dates in a textbook. It's a living force. It shapes our world right now, and it's going to influence our future. And I think by understanding how conflict started, how power was used to, dispossess certain groups, to marginalize them, we're in a better position to fight injustice now.
It's also about recognizing those common threads, the patterns, across what might seem like really different historical events. Like the whole concept of settler colonialism, such a powerful lens for understanding how systems of oppression, how violence has worked throughout history, all over the world.
And it's not about saying, oh, these histories are exactly the same. It's using comparison to, analyze, to see patterns, ideologies that we might miss otherwise.
I think it's a call to action, really. We can't just sit back, be passive bystanders.
Right.
You've got to learn from the past, challenge injustice now, and work towards a future where everyone's rights, their dignity are respected. That's, I think, what I hope our listeners take away from this.
Yeah, I agree. And to leave everyone with something to think about, there's this quote I really like. From Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, she writes, "Settler colonialism is a structure, not an event." Yeah. What she's saying is, these systems of oppression, they don't just disappear with time. They're baked into our institutions, our laws, even how we think.
So it's up to us in the 21st century to recognize those structures, understand how they work, and really actively try to dismantle them. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's absolutely essential if we want a world where we don't repeat those mistakes of the past.
Right. A world where justice and dignity win out for everyone.
I think that's a really powerful note to end on.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something we study.
No.
It's something we're living. And we all have a role to play in shaping the future. So thanks to everyone for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you found it, thought-provoking. We encourage you to keep exploring these histories, keep asking questions, and engage in that ongoing struggle for justice and reconciliation. Until next time.